Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome and thank you for joining us. So again, welcome to our third session of our New Jersey School Mental Health webinar series. This is session 3, Establishing Universal Prevention. This webinar is sponsored by the Northeast and Caribbean Mental Health Technology Transfer Center, or MHTTC, and we're housed at Rutgers in the School of Health Professions in the Department of Psychiatric Rehabilitation and Counseling Professions. My name is Kati, and I'm the project coordinator of this center, and will be facilitating this webinar today along with our colleagues from the Department of Education who are here joining us as well, along with our webinar co-presenters. Next slide, please. On your screen, you see that this is our third session, and our future sessions, we're hosting monthly webinar sessions. The schedule is listed on your screen, and I will also send out a flyer that has direct registration links. Our next session will be on Tuesday, January 25th, from 3 to 4:15 p.m. And that'll be session 4, establishing tier supports, tier 2 and tier 3. Next slide, please. We also are hosting a New Jersey school-based technical assistance call. Our next series of calls will be this Friday from 9 a.m. to 1 p.m. and they're in 1-hour time slots. Next slide, please. So a little bit about us. The MHTTC, we're funded by SAMHSA, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, to enhance the capacity of the behavioral health and other related workforces to deliver evidence-based and empirically supported practices to individuals with mental illnesses. We ask that you please visit the network website for additional information at mhttcnetwork.org. And our center has also received supplemental funding to support school teachers and staff to address student mental health and support healthcare providers in wellness and self-care activities. Next slide, please. On your screen, you'll see we have other MHTTC regions. We're Region 2, and we serve New York, New Jersey, the Virgin Islands, the U.S. Virgin Islands, and Puerto Rico. Next slide, please. We, like I mentioned before, we have a school mental health supplement, and supplemental funding was awarded to provide training in TA to teachers and school staff regarding student mental health. Next slide, please. On your screen, you'll also see the topic areas and focus areas that our center provides in terms of trainings and technical assistance. Next slide, please. And if you're interested in staying up to date with the events and products that our center is providing, we ask that you please sign up by using the bit.ly link that you see on the screen, and I'll also share this in our chat box. Following the webinar, you'll be asked to complete a brief survey. We value this feedback and use it to improve our activities and inform our future activities. The surveys are also important because our continued funding is linked to the completion of these surveys, so we thank you in advance for your participation. We also want to let you know that this webinar is being recorded and will be posted to our website along with the presentation slides or any relevant resources within 1 week of this webinar. This presentation was prepared for the Northeast and Caribbean Mental Health Technology Transfer Center under a cooperative agreement from the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, or SAMHSA. All material appearing in this presentation, except that taken directly from copyrighted sources, is in the public domain and may be reproduced or copied without permission from SAMHSA or the authors. Citation of the source is appreciated. We ask that you not reproduce or distribute this presentation for a fee without specific written authorization from the Northeast and Caribbean Mental Health Technology Transfer Center. At the time of this presentation, Miriam Delphin Britman served as Assistant Secretary for the Mental Health and Substance Use at SAMHSA. The opinions expressed herein are the views of the speakers and do not reflect the official position of the Department of Health and Human Services, or SAMHSA. No official support or endorsement of DHHS or SAMHSA for the opinions described in this presentation is intended or should be inferred. We encourage you to interact with our presenters during the webinar by using the chat feature. Please post any questions or comments you have in the chat, and I will collect your questions as we go and ask them of the presenter during the Q&A time towards the end of the presentation. During the webinar, our presenter may pose questions to you. So please use the chat feature to answer those questions. And let's begin our webinar. We have Ms. Christy Rybowski, Dr. Alicia Lukachko, and Dr. Matthew Murphy with us today. Ms. Rybowski joined the MHTTC team in 2020 as a school-based training and consultation specialist. Prior to joining the MHTTC team, she supported school teams with coaching, training, and technical assistance in the areas of social emotional learning, school mental health, and positive behavioral interventions and supports. She brings more than 15 years of experience in implementing and maintaining evidence-based practices in a variety of settings. She is passionate about improving the educational and social outcomes for urban communities. She has worked extensively in urban school districts of Philadelphia and Newark, working within schools and partnering with many inner-city grassroots, faith-based organizations, and local universities to align school-wide behavioral and mental health efforts with the local community. Dr. Lukachko works with the MHTTC as a senior training and consultation specialist in school mental health. She is a faculty member at Rutgers University Behavioral Healthcare and the Robert Wood Johnson Medical School, Department of Psychiatry. Alicia has a dual background in social work and public health, specializing in psychiatric epidemiology. She is a licensed therapist, a certified school social worker, and has extensive experience in program design, implementation, and evaluation. In addition to her current work in the areas of school-based mental health and peer support, Alicia's research interests have spanned the roles of culture, discrimination, and trauma on health and utilization of mental health services. Dr. Murphy has proudly served as the superintendent of the Ramsey Public Schools since 2012 and brings broad educational experience to the role. He began his career in Wyckoff, New Jersey as a teacher, a building-based technology coordinator, and as a vice principal. He then served as the assistant superintendent of curriculum and instruction, director of elementary education, and principal in the Westwood Regional School District. Prior to his superintendent role in Ramsey, Dr. Murphy was the school superintendent of Rivervale Public Schools. Under Dr. Murphy's leadership, the district has been awarded the Apple Distinguished Program designation. Dr. Murphy is also an adjunct professor at Ramapo College, where he teaches in the Educational Leadership Program, designed to equip prospective educators and administrators with essential content knowledge and skills for contemporary leadership in curriculum and supervision. So I will turn it now over to our presenter, and again, welcome everyone, and thank you for being with us.
Wow, thank you so much, Kati. I wanted to give a special thank you to our DOE New Jersey Department of Education representatives who are also on the call joining us, Dr. Maurice Ingram and Dr. Damian Patino. And so welcome. Good afternoon. Before we get started, it's always nice to know who is joining us. So please feel free to drop your district or school name and your role in the chat box. Today's session objectives are to understand evidence-based universal interventions, identify tips for implementation, recognize how to integrate and coordinate initiatives, and examine New Jersey best practice exemplars. So in the hustle and bustle of doing the work, it is easy to lose sight of why implementing a comprehensive school-based mental health framework is critical to the social and academic success of all students. So we thought it was important to pause and to start today's webinar with a reminder. Just last week, December the 7th, to be exact, the U.S. Surgeon General issued a new Surgeon General's advisory to highlight the urgent need to address the nation's youth mental health crisis. The Surgeon General's advisory calls for a swift and coordinated response to this crisis as the nation continues to battle the COVID-19 pandemic. It provides recommendations that we as a community can take to improve the mental health of children, adolescents, and young adults. Before the COVID-19 pandemic, mental health challenges were the leading cause of disability and poor life outcomes in young people, with up to 1 in 5 children ages 3 to 17 in the United States having a mental, emotional, developmental, or behavioral disorder. Additionally, from 2009 to 2019, the share of high school students who reported persistent feelings of sadness or hopelessness has increased by 40% to more than 1 in 3 students. Alan Cohen said, when it comes to pro-social education in schools, there is no option not to do it. It must be done. The only real question that we should ask ourselves is how to do it effectively and how to do it well. If this is your first time joining us, welcome. If you've attended the first or second webinar, welcome back. So far, we've learned that multi-tier systems of support is a framework that provides the overall structure for a comprehensive school mental health program. We also discussed the needs assessment and resource mapping process and how both of these can help reorganize resources to best meet the needs of students and your school community. Today, we will offer guidance on how to effectively implement Tier 1 supports. And next month, we will discuss establishing targeted interventions, Tiers 2 and 3. It's important to remember that developing and implementing a comprehensive school mental health system typically takes 5 years and occurs across multiple phases. And many of you on the call today are in different phases of implementation. And I really want to reassure you that that's okay. Our goal is to provide you with practical guidance and recommendations to help support your implementation efforts as you move forward. As a reminder, multi-tier systems of support, also known as MTSS, or here in New Jersey, NJTSS, emerged as a framework from the work conducted in public health, emphasizing 3 tiers of prevention. Problem prevention and wellness promotion are the underlying principles for each of the tiers within the MTSS framework. One important point to highlight is these tiers refer to levels of support students receive, not to students themselves. So for example, students receive Tier 2 supports, they are not Tier 2 students. Schools apply this model as a way to really align academic, behavioral, social, emotional, and mental health supports to improve the education for all students. And all students and staff should be exposed formally and in an ongoing manner to universal interventions. Tier 1 supports serve as the foundation for your framework. Tier 1 is designed to really reach all students, including students at risk for developing a mental health condition. It should be designed to really benefit everyone. In addition, universal prevention efforts produce long-term cost savings by preventing the onset of severity of later mental health conditions that could require more expensive treatment and often lead to out-of-district placement. Universal prevention activities help to really decrease the stigma about mental health and illness. For example, normalizing administering universal screeners as a means of early detection. No different than we administer hearing and vision screeners to detect early hearing and vision loss. Lastly, it's important to remember that mental health is a component to health, and students and staff need to be healthy in order to learn and teach. With that in mind, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Alicia, to discuss some examples of well-established Tier 1 practices. Alicia?
Thank you, Christy. I'd like to start off first with a poll question. And Kati, if you could just start that poll, I'd appreciate it. So for those of you in schools that are currently in the process of implementing universal or Tier 1 prevention efforts, what evidence-based practices are you currently implementing? And I'm just going to give you all a moment to respond to this poll question. I appreciate all the participation here. And Kati, I think we can close the poll now. Sorry for those of you who are still responding. So it looks as though social emotional learning is by far the most common, followed by positive behaviors and relationships. And then it looks like teacher or school staff well-being and positive discipline practices. So very interesting. Thank you everyone for your participation. Today we just want to provide an overview of, actually I'm going to just stop sharing the results here, excuse me. So today we're going to provide an overview of 3 relatively widely adopted universal evidence-based practices. And those include social emotional learning, positive behavioral interventions and supports, and restorative practices. And we're going to start here with social emotional learning. As defined by the Collaborative for Academic, Social, and Emotional Learning, SEL is a process through which children and adults acquire and effectively apply the knowledge, attitude, and skills necessary to understand and manage emotions, set and achieve positive goals, feel and show empathy for others and to others, establish and maintain personal relationships, and make responsible decisions. In simpler terms, SEL addresses the skills we need for happiness and success in school and life. It's how we understand ourselves, how we work well with others, and our ability to make good decisions. One thing that I want to point out about this definition is that it includes adults. So remembering that SEL isn't just for children, but can be useful for the entire school community. Next slide, please. So universal SEL interventions have been associated with a number of positive outcomes published in the peer review literature. These include improvements or increases in student social emotional competence, positive attitudes about self, others, and the school, pro-social behavior, positive peer and family relationships, academic performance, and school attendance. SEL has also been associated with reductions in conduct problems, emotional distress, substance use, clinical disorder, and utilization of mental health services as a potential indicator of reduced mental health challenges. These positive outcomes associated with SEL are encouraging, and it's important to recognize that SEL, like any Tier 1 practice, acts as a protective factor. The more protective factors in place, the more likely students are to thrive. Next slide, please. So the Svl Framework presented here was developed by the Collaborative for Academic and Social Emotional Learning, CASEL, and has been adopted by the New Jersey Department of Education. The framework offers a systemic approach to incorporating SEL in classrooms as well as school-wide, while partnering with families and community to reinforce core skills. These core skills include self-awareness, self-management, responsible decision-making, relationship skills, and social awareness. School climate and culture is particularly important when integrating SEL into the classroom and other school settings, including hallways, the cafeteria, and playgrounds. While SEL practices can contribute to positive school climate, they also depend on an environment in which all students and adults feel respected, supported, and engaged. SEL programs have been shown to be more effective when they extend into the home, and families are far more likely to be engaged in the process when schools take steps to be culturally appropriate in their approaches and actively include families, especially those from historically marginalized groups, in the planning and implementation of SEL. Considering this model, we can think of SEL as an enhancement to existing support systems. Next slide, please. Focusing a bit more closely on the 5 core competencies, self-awareness refers to the ability to understand one's own emotions, thoughts, and values, and how these factors influence our behavior. Self-management addresses the ability to effectively regulate or manage one's emotions, thoughts, and behaviors. Responsible decision-making describes the ability to make constructive choices about personal behavior and social interactions. Relationship skills are those essential to establishing and maintaining healthy and supportive relationships and effectively navigate settings with diverse individuals and groups. And finally, social awareness captures the capacity to understand others' perceptions, empathize with others, including individuals from diverse backgrounds, cultures, and contexts. Next slide, please. So in here we see some examples of SEL strategies associated with each core competency. Labeling emotions and emotional check-ins are two strategies to enhance self-awareness. Under self-management, we see positive self-talk and belly breathing. Ways to enhance responsible decision-making could include reflecting on choices and problem-solving. Relationship skills can be supported through practicing and modeling positive and assertive communication. And last, SEL strategies to strengthen social awareness might include sharing circles and reflecting on group work. Next slide, please. SEL competencies can be developed through a variety of strategies and approaches. When designing your SEL program, you might consider a single course approach, offering an individual class or SEL block, possibly utilizing an evidence-based SEL curriculum. With this approach, the responsibility most often lies on an individual teacher to deliver the SEL curriculum. While it might be more easily implemented, it's also harder to maintain sustainability. Another approach is curriculum infusion, where SEL is reflected and reinforced both inside and outside the classroom across the academic curriculum, such as language arts, math, science, and other subjects. This approach has been shown to enhance academics and helps establish sustainability. Next slide, please. So as mentioned before, SEL, as well as other universal evidence-based practices described here, can and should be applied across all grades and ages, starting with pre-K and extending through high school. SEL is a process of development, and what we see highlighted here is that with each developmental stage comes new age-differentiated developmental tasks, along with some social emotional needs or challenges that may persist. I think many times schools tend to think of SEL as something for younger children, but these practices are really critical to every stage of development and even for adults. As captured in the Castle model, school staff and parents, as well as caregivers and others, are key players in teaching, modeling, and reinforcing SEL. Many, if not all, could also directly benefit from SEL practices and support. And they would also support students while doing so. Next slide, please. Now we're going to turn our attention to another well-established evidence-based practice, positive behavioral interventions and supports, or Pbis. Pbis is an evidence-based three-tiered framework mirroring that of MTSS, which works towards establishing a social culture and the behavior supports needed to improve social, emotional, behavioral, and academic outcomes for all students. It's not a curriculum-based intervention, but focuses instead on systems change. Pbis was initially developed as a classroom-based program aimed at promoting positive and pro-social student behavior, but the approach has been expanded. And as it's described here, it's expanded into a comprehensive tiered systems framework, also known as school-wide Pbis. Many of you might know Pbis by slightly different names or acronyms, essentially referring to the same practices, which we'll describe in more detail. Next slide, please. While school-wide Pbis is a three-tiered framework, we're going to be focusing here on universal or tier 1 support, which includes systems, data, and practices that impact everyone across all settings. Tier 1 Pbis establishes a foundation for delivering regular, proactive support and for preventing unwanted behaviors. And it emphasizes pro-social skills and expectations by teaching and acknowledging appropriate student behavior. Next slide, please. The guiding principles of Pbis at the tier 1 level are to effectively teach appropriate behavior, again, to all children, intervene early before unwanted behaviors escalate, focusing on prevention. Use research-based, scientifically validated interventions whenever possible, and use data to inform decisions and monitor student progress. Next slide, please. Research indicates that PBIS is associated with a number of positive outcomes, some of them similar to what was seen with SEL, including improvements in student social emotional competence and academic performance, also increases in perceived efficacy among teachers, positive school climate, and perceptions of school safety. Studies have also found PBIS to include reductions in bullying behavior and self-reported substance use among students, office discipline referrals or ODRs, suspensions, restraints, and seclusions. Next slide, please. PBIS can be thought of as a process of first identifying the valued, culturally relevant outcomes that you want to have for your students. For example, decrease externalizing or disruptive behaviors, improved academics, or creating a positive and safe learning environment. We then identify the data needed to evaluate the valued outcomes and support decision-making. For example, we might examine office discipline referrals, attendance, or aggression, and we'll talk about this more a little bit later. Next, we need to select empirically supported practices to help us achieve these outcomes and support student behavior. These practices include strategies for teaching and also strategies for reinforcing. An academic example would be selecting an empirically supported core reading curriculum. Finally, we need to determine what is needed, referring to systems, for us to be able to accurately, reliably, and consistently implement the practices and support that staff would need. For example, staff training, planning time, feedback or mentoring, materials, and curriculum. Next slide, please. Looking more closely at data to evaluate outcomes of interest, such as academic or school success, schools might want to include office referrals or number of office referrals, number of school suspensions. They might also want to conduct a school climate survey or administer universal screeners for behavior, social, and/or academic risk. Some examples presented during our last webinar are social, academic, and emotional behavioral risk screener and the strengths and difficulties questionnaire. Next slide, please. Some of the systems in place that would support school-wide PBIS and actually other tier 1 practices would include an established leadership team, regular meetings, a commitment statement for establishing a positive school-wide social culture, ongoing use of data for decision-making, professional development plans, and personnel evaluation plans. Next slide, please. Finally, focusing on practices that accompany PBIS implementation, these would include school-wide positive expectations and behaviors, which are taught again to all students, establish classroom expectations that align with school-wide expectations. Here we see that consistency is important. There should be a continuum of procedures for encouraging expected behavior and a continuum of procedures for discouraging problem behavior. Practices would also include procedures for encouraging school-family partnerships. Next slide, please. And here are some examples of school-wide expectations that a school might adopt, including the expectation that students and school staff act in respectful, empathetic, responsible, kind, and safe ways. It's helpful to identify school-wide expectations that are easy to remember. And as a general rule, keep them to about 5 or fewer. It's also important for schools to clearly define these expectations in positive ways and review them regularly with students, staff, and families. Expectations can be prominently displayed along with the examples of actionable behaviors for students. Linking these expectations to school culture is another recommendation, social culture of the school, such as relating them to the school mascot. A very helpful document outlining school-wide expectations and examples of actionable behaviors can be found through the New Jersey Positive Behavioral Support in Schools, or NJPBSIS, which is included in our list of resources at the end of the presentation. Next slide, please. What does it look like to be respectful, empathetic, responsible, kind, and safe in settings throughout the building? And this, we're thinking classrooms, cafeterias, bathroom, hallway, etc. Here are some examples. Being respectful might be demonstrated by walking in line or using an inside voice, Yielding to others or using I statements would demonstrate empathy. Being responsible could include walking at all times in the school building or looking after your personal belongings. Kindness can be shown by keeping hands and feet to yourself or offering to help another student. And examples of acting in a safe manner could include following teacher directions and telling an adult if you feel uncomfortable. Again, while Pbis school-wide expectations will be consistent across schools, they should also be tailored to reflect the specific community needs and values. Next slide, please. As a final example of selected Tier 1 evidence-based practice, we're going to offer a brief overview of restorative practices. Next slide, please. Restorative practices involve the use of informal and formal processes to proactively build healthy relationships and a sense of community to prevent and address conflict and wrongdoing. The practice has its roots in restorative justice, which is a community-based approach to criminal justice that emphasizes repairing harm done to individuals and relationships rather than focusing on punishment of offenders. Restorative practices draw from ancient and indigenous practices or customs employed in several diverse cultures around the world, including African, Native American, Asian, and Arab cultures. Next slide, please. In the school setting, restorative practices are tools and strategies that can be incorporated into an MTSS framework. They work towards addressing and discussing the needs of the school community, building healthy relationships between educators and students, reducing, preventing, and improving harmful behavior, repairing harm and restoring positive relationships, resolving conflict, holding individuals and groups accountable. Next slide, please. Research continues to grow in the field of restorative practices, and so far evidence points to increases in positive school climate and, importantly, reductions in exclusionary discipline rates and racial disparities in discipline. Exclusionary discipline includes any type of disciplinary action that removes or excludes a student from their usual educational setting, such as suspensions and expulsions. Research has indicated that students of color and those with disabilities are more likely to receive more severe school discipline, including exclusionary measures. These measures have been linked to a number of negative consequences for students and communities, including increased risks of school dropout and student involvement in the justice system. Restorative practices can provide an alternative to these potentially detrimental disciplinary approaches. Next slide, please. There are a number of types of restorative practices that can be utilized in schools, including restorative justice, community conferencing, community service, peer juries, circle processes, and peer mediation. And while we don't have time during this webinar to review all of those, we do have resources that we'll point to that can help gain a better understanding of these practices. Next slide, please. In addition to the more formal restorative practices introduced in the last slide, informal restorative practices can also be integrated both inside and outside of the classroom with use of affective statements, communicating individual feelings and impacts using I statements, and also using effective questions that prompt reflection on how one's behavior might have affected others. As you can see, these practices align well with SEL and Pbis. Next slide, please. And aligning universal practices is something that Chrissy will discuss in just a moment, but it's important to see that the practices presented here are complementary. In fact, one study showed that implementing SEL and Pbis together was more effective than either alone. And that may be the case for other complementary universal practices. Next slide, please. We're going to turn now to universal screening, which is a key element of Tier 1 practices. Universal screening is a systematic process for identifying students who might benefit from more intensive individualized support beyond the universal Tier 1 prevention efforts. Like all Tier 1 activities, it involves all students. The screening should be conducted at multiple time points, for example, fall, winter, and spring, to assess changes in risk and protective factors being assessed. Universal screening should be proactive, seeking to identify students early who might benefit from more individualized support. And last but not least, the tools and methods utilized in screening efforts should be well established, reliable, and valid. Next slide, please. And here's some questions to consider when approaching universal screening. What types of behaviors, symptoms, attitudes, or skills, risk and protective factors, are you trying to capture? For example, social emotional competence, conduct-related problems, depression, perceptions of school climate. What kinds of data are you currently collecting that can be informative? If you have data that might be useful and is already being collected, use it. Right? Things like office referrals, absences, school suspensions as indicators of school student functioning and well-being. You also want to ask how and how often you will be collecting these data. It's important to have updated data to inform practices, but there is also a balance with feasibility. What are the logistics and protocols involved in carrying out universal screenings, including the potential need for parental consent and student assents, and protections of privacy and confidentiality? Next slide, please. And just as a review, universal data collection can include self-reported assessments, teacher-staff observation reports, and existing student data. A great resource for exploring and identifying universal screeners and assessment tools is the School Health Assessment and Performance Evaluation, or SHAPE system. And this was developed by the National Center for School Mental Health. And we've listed this resource or these resources in our slides as well. Finally, additional considerations can include the feasibility, frequency, timing of assessments. Think of how long an assessment might take, the resources that might be needed to manage and analyze data, and the potential costs. Measures should be age appropriate, which goes back to the importance of robust and appropriate measures and methods. It's critical that screening tools and assessments are culturally appropriate, reflective and responsive of your school community. Last, when utilizing data, approach the process from a strengths-based versus a student deficit focus. I'm going to turn now to Christy, who will be discussing tips for selecting and implementing universal evidence-based interventions.
Thank you, Alicia. So when selecting the intervention and practices for your school or district, here are some things to consider. One thing you want to do is ensure it addresses the need of your school or district. The needs assessment and resource mapping process is helpful when trying to identify gaps in existing services. Also remember, as Alicia mentioned, to use the data you already have available to you: office discipline referrals, attendance, universal screeners, etc. Consider if the interventions and practices are a good contextual fit. For example, have you taken cultural and linguistic considerations into account? Determine whether services and supports are evidence-based, and ensure you have adequate resources for implementation. Lastly, consider sustainability of programs and interventions very early on. So for example, with SEL and Pbis practices, it would be helpful to identify teacher leaders or champions that can help drive implementation efforts over time. But before we discuss some tips for implementation, we like to have an idea about what challenges you may have faced or are currently facing when developing your Tier 1 system. Kati, can you launch the second poll, please? All right, so we'll give folks just a few minutes. The second poll just says, what challenges has your school faced in implementing Tier 1 evidence-based interventions? So I see the responses coming in. Thank you so much for your participation. Oh, great. All right, awesome. Kati, can you end the poll and share our results? Okay, so it looks like, very interesting. So it looks like administrative or staff buy-in is leading at 42%. We have program implementation and coordination and data collection and sustainability that are all pretty close as well. Okay, thank you so much for participating. So understanding that we may encounter a few barriers along the way, we thought it was important to highlight a few tips for implementation. The literature and research tells us, so it's interesting to see your results. That schools and districts that really are the most successful have administrative support and buy-in. Buy-in meaning that the administrator has a good understanding of comprehensive school-based mental health and provides the necessary time and resources to support implementation. Things like driving action plans or supports district and school level teams in the process, provides resources to support the work. So time for training and the necessary staff. Staff buy-in is just as important to implementation as well. So staff buy-in is really about the commitment to the principles behind the philosophy of the intervention. So for example, when implementing universal Pbis practices, the explicit teaching of behavior and providing positive reinforcement. In order to help establish buy-in, consider the following strategies. So ask for staff's input and feedback early in the process and throughout implementation. Take the temperature of your staff by distributing a survey to understand if they are in favor or against implementation. And use your data to highlight the need for change. And also highlight the positive changes very early on in the process. Using data to help guide your implementation efforts. So for example, if you administer a universal screener and the data shows you have a high number of students experiencing anxiety, it may be a good idea to implement Tier 1 SEL practices that help teach coping skills. But if you have a high number of office discipline referrals, you may want to start with focusing on teaching the behavioral expectations. And another thing to consider is adopting a common language to describe your integrated supports. So some schools and districts have used universal mental health promotion or positive school culture and climate with specific goals and intended outcomes. And I know we've discussed establishing a core team. The team is the coordinating body for universal Tier 1 supports. Ultimately, the team is responsible for developing and implementing Tier 1. And successful teams are representative of your school community, including teachers from different grade bands, community providers, administrators, students and parents, and school-based mental health professionals. Additionally, the team should meet monthly and assess fidelity of implementation at least twice a year to help really drive the decision-making. And lastly, communication is key. Make sure the staff and the larger school community is aware of your vision and goals. Many strategies and programs are implemented in schools, but are often not integrated or coordinated in their planning, delivery, or management. Research tells us it's more efficient to align initiatives, have fewer teams with overlapping functions, and coordinate all school mental health activities. So aligning and integrating your programs and strategies is known as the Interconnected Systems Framework, or ISF. ISF promotes using a single system of delivery for educational and mental health supports in schools. ISF is really designed to enhance multi-tier systems of support by integrating student mental health into existing structures. It helps to really facilitate greater community partnerships, collecting wider scope of data, and ultimately helps to expand interventions to address mental health for staff and students. Many times when community health providers are supporting mental health needs in schools, they work in isolation from other existing programs. And when we work in silos, there is a lack of coordination between the providers and school teams. And oftentimes this approach doesn't allow us to see the lasting outcomes we would like to. We should draw on the strength and expertise of both community providers and school systems to impact larger change and greater outcomes. So now that we have a good understanding about Tier 1 universal supports, selecting the best interventions for your district, and really how to strategically align our work, let's hear about one district's implementation journey. So we are so lucky to have Dr. Matthew Murphy join us today, the superintendent for Ramsey Public Schools. He is going to talk to you about how his district and community is really prioritizing the mental health of its students. Dr. Murphy, thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you very much. And I just want to say thank you for these webinars. I think they're fantastic. And I've been taking notes from Alicia and yourself. So thank you for doing this. Next slide, please. So we are located in northern New Jersey. We have about 2,700 students, 500 staff members. We are predominantly white and upper middle class. So during this presentation, I'm going to take you on a whole part whole journey, and you'll see I put together a timeline that we can refer back to later on during the Q&A. And I try to identify what I thought the challenges were from the school administrator perspective, the school superintendent. So to begin with, I want to take you from the district perspective and what we've done and what we're doing. So we started a professional relationship with West Bergen, which is the largest not-for-profit provider of mental health in Bergen County. And I think this is an area that I think public schools have been really lacking, and that is creating a synergy between these wonderful organizations and public schools. Sometimes we're very defensive of our own turf. And while we're great at teaching English and English literacy and world language and social studies, our expertise is not necessarily in mental health. So I realized that creating and developing a professional relationship would only be beneficial. I'm also a first aid mental health trainer, both for youth and adult, and I have now turnkey that to our staff. We did that with our administrators, and now we're training all of our staff members in mental health first aid. And this is part of a district-wide approach for our staff members, kind of a tier 1 approach. I also developed a warm line for our families and our staff members during COVID, and this provides direct access to a non-Ramsey employee, a counselor at West Bergen. It would be free and confidential for any family member or staff member who's feeling overwhelmed during the pandemic. So these are just some of the things along the way we have been doing. Next slide, please. So on the school level, what we've done is I have hired 2 additional mental health counselors that are not tied to guidance or child study team. This has been invaluable. They work off hours, so they work on the weekends and at night, which help our parents who are not always available during the day. We, about 2 years ago, wrote a 9th grade mental health curriculum. We're going to be revising that. We've also implemented Mark Ruler's ruler approach. Mark is out of Yale. I highly recommend his book, Permission to Feel. He actually came in and spoke to our whole community about it. It was actually the day before New Jersey schools shut down in the pandemic. But we've been implementing the ruler approach K-5, and now we've brought it to the 6 through 8. And many of the things that Alicia was talking about in her wonderful presentation is embedded in the ruler approach. All of our students in 10th grade this spring will be trained in mental health first aid. I feel it's as important as CPR training that we do in 9th grade. And we also conduct a depression screening for 7th, 8th, and 10th graders. And I'm going to go into that in the next slide. Okay. So many of you are counselors. I saw that in the chat. So thank you so much for what you do for our students in New Jersey. God bless you. So I had this idea of taking the Columbia depression scale. We automated it through a Google form, and we've been doing it now for a couple of years, and it's been amazing. It has identified students that have not been on our radar screen. And we started with 1 grade level last year or 2 years ago, and then we moved it to 2, and we've moved it to 3. And I can tell you it's a little bit time intensive, but well worth it, because every single time we've done it, we've identified someone who is not on our radar screen. Next slide, please. This is where I just kind of outlined our tiered approach. It's a little generic and basic. You already know about the 3 tiers, but what was really interesting is in our most recent survey, our students didn't feel comfortable asking for help. And I thought that was really telling. And we've used that to help guide us over the last 12 to 18 months. And I cannot say enough about getting the students' voice involved in their own mental health. Next slide. Okay. So those are some of the things we've done on the district and on the school level, but what I'm here really to advocate is bringing the school and the community together. And this is something that we've been doing over the last few years. And we've had awareness days for mental health. May is Mental Health Awareness Month, as you know. So we identify a day in which we bring out age-appropriate guest speakers and presentations and panels. We wear green for the stigma. We wear those at athletic events during the fall, spring, and winter. The community events also include 1 book, 1 read. That's what I call it. An example is Mark Brackett. Another example, a picture here, is of Kate Fagan, who wrote the book, What Made Maddie Run, which is a very, very intense story of Madison Holleran, who I think it was about 10 years ago, died by suicide. She was a freshman at the University of Pennsylvania, wonderful scholar athlete, had multiple scholarships. And, you know, I think what made her story so powerful was she did not look like what appears to be a mentally ill, you know, the false perception of what a mentally ill student is. And we brought Kate Fagan in, and Carly Bushhoven is her sister, who's now the president of the Madison Holleran Foundation. She lives in New Jersey. She's literally begging to get into school, so she has been a guest speaker. We do an annual walk and talk mental health event every year. Again, all of this is made to bring the community together with our schools, with West Bergen, meaning we need, I think schools need to be the connected piece between each of these 3 wonderful resources that are out there. And I think I can speak for most school superintendents. It's not that we don't want to address these needs. It's just difficult to get them all organized, get them all in the same room, and help to prioritize that within the school day and then within the events that are taking place. So I am very active on social media. I do a little Let's Talk Mental Health YouTube show that has, at its last count, 11 subscribers, I think. And the reason I do that, again, is just to bring awareness to my community about the mental health issues facing our young children today and tomorrow and the next day. And if you are a school employee, I can't say enough about using the power of social media to help break down the stigma attached to it. So this community piece has been as important as the district and school-based piece, because now we have families working in conjunction with our school employees, you know, our CST members, our counselors, to help get them the resources that they truly need. And I'll just want to add or end with this, that I think community leaders have a duty. I think right now we're facing the greatest health crisis of my lifetime. And while we thought September 2021 was going to be a little bit normal than the last 2 years, it's quite the opposite. We have seen the greatest spike in school clearances, HIBs, and I don't want to say fights, but behaviors than I would say in my 8 years in being a superintendent in Ramsey. And I absolutely believe it's because, in no small part, of the last 3 years of disruptive education due to the pandemic. Therefore, I think our responsibility as school leaders, not just superintendents, but school counselors, is to really advocate for some of the things that we've heard about, but actually doing them, and trying to make a difference in the lives of our students. So I know I was rather quick, but I was worried about the time. So I hope I wasn't too quick.
Not at all, not at all, Dr. Murphy. I think what we're going to do actually is transition to questions. So I'll give Kati just a moment to, and if to all of our participants that are joining us, if you have questions, please feel free to put them in the Q&A pod. So then that way we can ask those questions. I do believe, Dr. Murphy, though, we have some questions that have already come in. So
Great.
I'll turn it over to Kati.
Thank you, Christy. So Dr. Murphy, we do have some questions here. And one that I have is the 2019 student survey that you mentioned, was this a standardized assessment or something Ramsey put together on their own? Also, can you give a few more examples of what other types of questions you asked the students on how you've been able to use that data?
Yeah, that's great. We use a company called Youth Truth out of the West Coast. And while I don't have the survey in front of me, I would be glad to, if that person wants to reach out to me, I would be glad to reach out to the person and share. But there were questions. So it is a standardized assessment. We didn't make it up. And we do it every year. And it was, do you feel safe? Do you feel comfortable? Do you know who to contact? Those were the types of questions that we were asking our students in 4th grade through 12th grade.
I see. Thank you so much. Our next question that we have is, how did you communicate the depression screening to parents, and how was it generally received?
I'm a very straight talker. So I wrote a letter about my concerns with mental health. And in that timeline that I showed you, I'd been doing a lot of work with the community, and I've been foreshadowing a screening protocol. And I would say to you, maybe I have 5 opt-outs in the entire district. So I mean, I didn't do every grade level. I think I did 7th, 8th, and 10th this year. Maybe 5 students opted out of 600. So they were very appreciative. And I can tell you, it flagged some that were already on our radar screen, but more importantly, it flagged a handful that weren't. And those families were so grateful for for this, type of screening and intervention, because then they worked with us in getting them or the children the proper help that they needed.
I see. So it's safe to say it was generally well received.
Absolutely. And
Wonderful.
it's simple to do. It's free to do. You don't need to worry about that.
Got it. And you also mentioned that you received parental consent for the depression screening. What was your approach? Did you also have a process for parental consent for the student survey?
Yes, so like everything else is now, everything is digitized. So you had to go into our, they had to go into the portal and check off that they agreed with it.
I see. Thank you. And then we also have a question in the chat. How do counselors manage the responses to the screening tool? This person says, I love the idea of this, but we only have one counselor per school, and I wonder about their ability to respond to the screening.
Yeah, great question. And that's a counselor's hat asking questions. So we identified the days in which we were giving the screening. It was digitized. So it was actually a Google form. And we had our counselor. Again, I pulled in West Bergen counselor and guidance counselor who were there. So for those who don't know the screening, there are certain questions that are flagged. And if those questions are flagged, you immediately do a face-to-face screening. So we just said to ourselves, this is important to do, X out these days. We had counselors from West Bergen who helped us as well to be on site. But you're right, whoever asked that question, you're absolutely right. You have to be intentional about when you do it and who is there to help. I will tell you that this is our third year of doing it. We overplanned the first year the amount of help that we needed, and we're getting better at predicting the number of responses and the number of bodies that we would need to be there to deal right away with the students.
I see. And then we have a follow-up question to that. Did you ever run into an issue with the student completing a screening and not including their name?
Absolutely not. No, it's required.
Okay. I see. Well, thank you. I think that concludes our question and answer period portion of the webinar. Next slide, please.
Thank you so much, Kati. So I'll just take our participants through the last couple of slides, and then we can transition to the survey. One of the things that was really important to us is that everybody had a good understanding for a lot of the key terminology that we were using during the call. I know a lot of times it can be very confusing. Again, I know that we like to make our slides available to all of you on our website. And so we just thought that this would be helpful as a reference later on, as well as the resources and links. So we talked about the Sel Framework, Pbis, the SHAPE system, again, just making sure that all of those resources are available to you as well. I believe when Kati sends the follow-up email with the slides, these resources will also be embedded in that email. And then lastly, our team reflection questions. So we always like to include reflection questions at the end of each of our sessions. Again, just so that way you can take it back to your school-based teams and kind of have some further discussion about the topics that we've covered today. And Kati, I'll turn it over to you to help guide folks through the survey.
Thank you, Christy. So on your screen, if you have a mobile device, you can either access our short evaluation survey by hovering over to the QR code and completing our survey there, or you can also do it by clicking on the link that I just included in the chat box. This link will also be emailed to all of you to the email that you registered and attended today's webinar, along with a link to our webinar recording and our presenter slides. And again, those will be available within a week. We will also email all of our today's participants a certificate of completion. So please let us know if you have not received it, and I can send the request over to the person who handles certificates of completion or professional development. Next slide, please. On your screen, you'll see our contact information if you have any questions. And I believe also Dr. Murphy had included his email in the chat box. Thank you, Dr. Murphy, for that. Again, we want to thank you all for joining us today. We understand that this topic is very important on all levels, and we wanted to make sure that our contact information is there and shared with you in case you have any follow-up questions or you had any comments or suggestions for any of our future trainings and events. We hope that you found today's webinar useful in your work, and we hope that you also join us for additional trainings and events. This concludes our webinar for today. Do you have any other last comments before we end? Any of our co-presenters?
No, just really quickly, I just wanted to say a huge thank you to Dr. Murphy for joining us today. Your voice and perspective is so critical and powerful as it relates to this work. And then just, wishing all of you a safe, happy, and healthy holiday season.
Thank you, Christy. Yes, everyone, we hope that you continue to stay safe and well. Thank you all. Enjoy the rest of your day.